cumplir esta complicada y agradable tarea de presentar a Andrew Bennett. Andy es probablemente más conocido en nuestro medio por sus trabajos de metodología en ciencias políticas. Él es prácticamente co-creador del process tracing, uno de los métodos más usados en ciencia política y cada vez más usados también en relaciones internacionales. Andy, el otro aspecto de Andy que no es muy conocido en Ecuador es, que él es uno de los leading experts, uno de los grandes autores, uno de los principales autores sobre conflictos militares, guerras en particular, y además Andy, cuando hizo su doctorado, escribió su tesis sobre el militarismo soviético. Estas son las razones por las cuales invitamos al profesor Bennett a que estuviera esta noche con nosotros. El propósito de la charla, el propósito general de las dos charlas que hemos dado, la anterior y esta, es ir más allá de lo que vemos en la prensa, de lo que accedemos a través de los medios, básicamente porque es información, aún en los medios mejor informados y más objetivos y neutrales, está cargada de sesgos. Y además es tan abundante que es muy difícil hacer sentido de lo que está pasando en Ucrania, de lo que está pasando con esta guerra. Para los que hemos vivido los acontecimientos de finales del siglo XX y este siglo, hemos visto un conjunto de guerras, no ha sido una época pacífica, hemos visto un conjunto de guerras interestatales, algunas más dramáticas que otras, pero sin lugar a dudas la guerra en Ucrania nos ha sorprendido a todos, no solamente al público en general, sino también a especialistas. Así es que para ir más allá de ese vacío de información y hacer un análisis sistemático y profundo, es que decidimos hacer estas conferencias y en particular la del día de hoy. Les agradezco a todos los que están participando, a quienes están atendiendo este seminario, por las circunstancias muy especiales de que es un jueves antes de un largo fin de semana, y sin embargo ustedes han mostrado un enorme compromiso y un enorme interés con este tema al venir el día de hoy. Sin más prólogos, le voy a dejar la palabra a Andy Bennett. Andy, please, the floor is open for you.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you for inviting me. As Pablo mentioned, I've written over many years about Soviet and Russian foreign policy and American foreign policy also, and I've worked in the Defense Department and in the U.S. Congress, so I have a perspective on this issue from a number of different. And so the first point to make is that President Putin in his entire career has succeeded through the use of military force. The first way he came to power and stayed in power was by using force in Chechnya, which is part of Russia, but was trying to break away from Russia. And also early on, he sent forces into Georgia and to other parts of the former Soviet Union. Then in 2008, he used force again in Georgia, and in 2015 in Syria. And most importantly, he used force in 2014 in Ukraine. And from his point of view, that was one of the most successful times that he used force because it was very popular among the Russian citizens. Now, at that time, he took control of Crimea, where Russia has military naval bases. And he also took control of two small territories in eastern Ukraine. Now, at that time, he also tried to start an uprising in the region in Ukraine, but that failed. And so this time he's trying much more aggressively, I think at a time that he thought the United States was at a low point because of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. I have to say, I personally was very surprised. I didn't expect him to try to take over the entire country. And that's for all the reasons we see now. It has not been successful. It's united the Ukrainian people. It's united the NATO alliance. Now, Finland and Sweden are thinking of joining NATO. So from Putin's point of view, it's not been successful in any way. So now I think he is trying to lower expectations and to set lower and perhaps more achievable goals in Ukraine. So I want to say a little bit about what are the possible ways that this could end and what does political science tell us about that. So I think there are 6 areas of research in political science that are important for understanding this process. And the first one is how do wars end? We call it war termination. The second one is how do authoritarian leaders leave power or authoritarian exit? The third one is how do mass uprisings or revolutions happen? The fourth one is how do coups happen and how do governments try to prevent coups from happening? The fifth one is how do sanctions work and when do they work? And the final one is how do negotiations happen when both sides are paying a price every day? We call it a hurting stalemate. So I will say something about each of these and then I'll open it up for questions and discussion. So to understand how wars end, we have to understand how they often start. Before a war starts, it's hard to tell who's willing and able to fight and who is just bluffing to get a better negotiated outcome. And when a war actually starts, then you know who's willing to fight and you see very quickly who's probably going to win, usually. So the question is, why don't wars end more quickly when it becomes clear which side is likely to win? And one of the scholars who's studied this is a professor named Hein Gomans. And he finds that authoritarian leaders are unlikely to make concessions to end a war, even if they know they're losing. And the reason for that is that when an authoritarian leader loses a war or negotiates concessions, they may lose power and they may even lose their life. So even when they're losing, they gamble, they take big risks to try to create a win somehow. And so this is what Putin is doing now. He's gambling that he can be more successful by concentrating his forces in Donbass than he was to try to take over the whole country. Okay, so the second literature is how do authoritarian leaders leave power? In the last 100 years, about 1 out of 5 end up in exile outside of their country. About 1 out of 8 end up in prison, and 1 out of 20 end up getting killed. So if you add that up, about 1 out of 3 leave office in a very bad way. And now that we have an international criminal court, they also worry about being prosecuted if they lose a war. So these are all the reasons that they fight very hard, even when they're losing a war. And President Putin was very angry when the intervention in Libya ended up killing Muammar Gaddafi. He very much fears that that could be his fate if there's a successful revolution or coup in Russia. So the third literature is about how do revolutions happen, how do uprisings happen. So the rebels have a dilemma. How do they get people to take risks to try to change the government? It's hard to get people to take risks because if the revolution succeeds without them, they will benefit without taking any risks. And we've seen thousands of Russians getting arrested or beaten up without much chance of overthrowing their government. The government also has a dilemma. How do they repress or stop a revolution without provoking people to be angry and fight harder? And elites have a dilemma. They want to be on the winning side and they don't know which side is going to win. And even if elites don't like the government, they can't afford to say that until they think the government is going to lose. So revolutions almost never succeed without some elites changing sides from the government to the opposition. And now, even though we see some oligarchs are not happy with losing some of their fortune, they're not switching sides. Some of them have been a little bit critical of Putin, but only the ones who are not inside of Russia. So I would say a successful street uprising is very unlikely since the security forces are so strong and there's not a sign that a lot of elites will switch sides. So that brings us to another area of research, which is how does a coup happen and how do governments try to prevent them? We call it coup proofing. So Putin has taken many steps to try to prevent any possibility of a coup. He's created many overlapping security forces. So even if defectors convince one to join the opposition, all the rest are still on the government side. And he created a new National Guard of 400,000 troops just about 6 years ago. And like I said, the oligarchs are unhappy with Putin, but they're not in a position to create a coup. They don't really have ties or connections to the security forces, and if they try to create them, they might be discovered. So while I would not say a coup is impossible, it's not likely. And it's almost impossible to predict a coup from the outside. because the coup plotters are not going to reveal themselves until they're actually starting a coup. When the American Soviet expert Adam Ulam was asked why he didn't predict Khrushchev falling from power, he said, Khrushchev couldn't predict Khrushchev falling from power. How could I? So when coups are attempted, they succeed about 1/2 of the time. But as I said, the security forces are very much in charge of the Russian government. Many of the key people are former KGB who Putin has known many years. In Russian, we call them siloviki, the men of power. So the fifth question is, how do sanctions work and when do they work? And many people don't understand this question because they expect sanctions to work right away. But if you threatened to make sanctions and somebody chose to do aggression anyway, they already knew you were going to put sanctions in place. So they've already included the cost of sanctions in the decision to use force. So sanctions can impose a cost. They can deter future intervention, but they're unlikely to quickly reverse an intervention that's already started. The only way they reverse an action that an actor started is if the sanctions are much tougher and more united than that actor expected them to be. And I think these sanctions are tougher and more united than Putin expected, but not enough to get him to reverse his course. Yeah. So as long as Europe is buying oil and gas from Russia, Putin thinks he can, and he can also sell oil and gas to China or to India. So this brings us to the final literature on the way that the war might end. And this is what we call a herding stalemate. Each side is paying a price every day, and there's not a good chance that they will have a sudden victory. And we're not to that stage yet because Putin doesn't care much about the pain that he causes to other people. And he still thinks he can win at least some military victories if he concentrates his force in eastern Ukraine. Now, Zelensky has given some indications that he's willing to make some concessions on important issues. He can't agree that Crimea is not part of Ukraine, but he suggested that could be discussed in 10 or 15 years. And the same thing for the areas that Russia already occupied in the Donbass. And those are difficult concessions at a time when his people and his citizens are being killed by the Russians. So I don't expect that he will make many more concessions than that. And Putin will not be serious about negotiations until this new offensive fails. So while I think a negotiated solution is the most likely outcome, it will be a month or longer before that gets serious. So let me stop there and open up for questions. And thank you very much for the translation. I know it's difficult.
No. Ok, ya tenemos unas cuantas preguntas. Bernardo Vázquez dice, teniendo en cuenta que las fuerzas de seguridad son tan fuertes e importantes y que se necesita para dar el golpe de Estado que la élite tome un bando, se pregunta, ¿tiene que explotar una crisis humanitaria severa o de grandes proporciones en Rusia para que haya un cambio de gobierno?
Professor Andrew, the first question is that if you consider that a huge humanitarian crisis should occur in Russia in order for a regime change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't think you're going to see an enormous humanitarian crisis in Russia. They're still getting the money for the oil, as I mentioned, and they have domestic access to food supply and all that. So when people ask, can we expect the Russian citizens to get out in the streets in large numbers, I remind them that Americans still believe in Trump after 5 years. So many Russians only get their news from TV, and the government has dominated TV for 15 years. So we can't get accurate polls about Russian opinion because they won't tell us what they really think, but every indication is that a lot of Russians support this war. And I think many people outside of Russia overestimate the opposition because the Russians they know are educated and urban. Yeah, and there's no, the opposition leaders, Navalny is the key one, and he's in jail.
La próxima, Marcelo Aldaz, de hecho, cuestiona el punto de partida. se pregunta por qué se empezó analizando a Putin como actor principal de la guerra en Ucrania y por qué no se analizó los motivos por los cuales Rusia decidió invadir a Ucrania.
The question is that why did you focus on Putin and instead of analyzing the diverse elements that are behind the decision by Putin to start this war?
I think this war, more than any war since World War II, really did rely on one person.
Una persona.
Now, there are other forces, of course, Russian culture, a culture of militarism, the people in power who gain from access to, but all those people are paying a high price, and many of them seem very surprised at the decision that Putin made. It's a very personalistic regime. So remember also that the Minister of Defense is not really a career military person. He's a person that Putin appointed as a sort of a personal friend. So this is not the military as an institution looking for a reason to justify its existence. It really is a very small circle around Putin, and it's gotten smaller in the last few years because of COVID. The Western leaders who have met with Putin in the last few years have noticed that his behavior has changed quite dramatically. He looks physically different. It's hard to tell if there may be something medical going on there. So many elites in Russia were really amazed and astonished at the decision to go to war. If they knew it was going to happen, they would have moved their yachts to different harbors.
Así es que voy a pasar a la pregunta de Pablo Barragán, que dice si el ejército, si el batallón Azov trabaja para el gobierno ucraniano.
The question, a ver, déjame ver la pregunta un ratito.
Literalmente it says, Azov army, does the Azov army works in the Ukrainian government? So what I think that he is trying to say is that if he works with the Ukrainian government.
Yes, so there's this Azov group that is a big part of Russian propaganda. It does exist, and they are ultra-nationalist. The Azov group is fighting against the Russians in the city of Mariupol. So they're not influential in the Ukrainian government. And just to show how insane the propaganda is, Putin complains about Nazis and Zelensky is Jewish. So Russian propaganda is the most unbelievable I've seen since, not even World War II compares. They've been saying that the atrocities in Bucha, which many journalists from many countries have seen, were fake or staged. So as many propagandists do, they take something that has a small bit of truth and they turn it into something much bigger or different. And the Azov Brigade is one of those stories.
Iván Ramírez Borbor pregunta, ¿qué tan probable es que Europa deje de comprar el gas natural y el petróleo rusos para aumentar la presión sobre Rusia y que terminen las hostilidades en Ucrania?
Is it possible that Europe will not buy more Russian oil and petroleum in order to stop or press Putin in order to stop the war?
Yeah, Europe gets about 40% of its natural gas from Russia. It's very difficult for them to shut that off in the middle of a winter. And there's a limit to how much other countries can give natural gas to Europe. You need special ships and you need special port facilities to safely handle a lot of natural gas. So in the short term, there aren't many good alternatives for Europe. But in the long term, Europe can do a lot to reduce its reliance on Russian oil and gas. The winter will end soon, and then they have months to prepare for less gas next winter. And some economists have studied that they think Germany, which is the most dependent, would not pay a big price for cutting off the oil and gas. But so far, Germany's leader, Olaf Scholz, has been critical of that study, and he doesn't look like he's going to cut off the gas anytime soon. And remember, if they cut it off, the Russians will try to sell it to the Chinese, and the Chinese will be happy to pay a low price for gas.
Elizabeth Ordóñez se pregunta por el riesgo de una guerra nuclear. y añade de ocurrir una guerra nuclear, ¿qué le esperaría al mundo, dado que hay varios países que tienen armamento militar nuclear?
Is there any chance for a nuclear war, and what would the world will expect if that would occur?
Yeah. I would like to say there is zero chance, but I can't quite go there. Putin has very publicly made a reference to nuclear weapons. And that's clearly one of the reasons that the United States and others are not giving fighter aircraft to Ukraine. And it's quite possible he's bluffing, but we don't want to find out. Keep in mind that some of the weapons Russia is already using are almost as big as the smallest nuclear weapons in their explosive power. Now, the only scenario where I think Putin might actually use nuclear weapons would be if he's losing really badly in Donbass, and he might use a local, what we call a tactical nuclear weapon. He's already shown he's willing to destroy entire cities, but there's still a very strong taboo against using nuclear weapons. And he would probably even lose China's support if he did that. So I think it's unlikely unless he's extremely desperate, and even unlikely then. Yeah, but I can't say it's zero because he's, like I said, he has destroyed cities.
Esta pregunta tiene un cierto prólogo. Dice, Dostoyevsky decía que Rusia se formó bajo el látigo y que la libertad solo es un privilegio para pocos. ¿Putin sería perpetuo? Entonces, al estilo de lo que ocurre con Al-Assad en Siria.
Voy a refrasear. The question goes in the direction if you think that Putin will be a leader that would last in power for for many years, or you think that his term will be short or medium term?
Well, it's been many years already, too many from my point of view. But it's very hard to tell from the outside. Gorbachev was asked, what kind of Soviet Union do you want to leave for leaders 20 years from now? And he said, I plan to be a Soviet leader in 20 years from now. And not only was he not a leader anymore, there was no Soviet Union anymore. I think a common mistake we make in predictions is to think that extreme outcomes can't happen. And we're now in one of those extreme scenarios. So I really can't say where Putin will be in 1 year or 10 years. If I did know that, I would probably be investing in cryptocurrency.
Mario Ernesto se pregunta si Finlandia y Suecia no se pondrían en una situación similar a la que tenía Ucrania antes de la invasión rusa si pidiesen ser admitidas en la OTAN.
Hasta ahí vamos. If Finland and Sweden would not be in the position that Ukraine was before the invasion, in order for them to be admitted in NATO.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so as you probably know, the public opinion in Finland and Sweden is much more supportive of joining NATO now than it was 2 months ago. Now, the understanding in NATO was that Georgia and Ukraine were really very unlikely to ever join NATO. In fact, NATO never brings in a country that already has a conflict on its territory. And Russia already occupies parts of Georgia and Ukraine. So this is why Putin had no real reason to think that those countries would ever join NATO. And he could veto that by just keeping his forces on occupied territory. But Finland and Sweden are very different. They're not in that category. When NATO expanded in the 1990s, American military officers were very worried about joining, including the Baltic republics. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they couldn't add to NATO's capabilities, and they could only become small targets for Russia. But we added them to NATO, and now we're obligated to defend them. Again, Sweden and Finland are in a different category from them. These are big countries with pretty considerable military capabilities. And I think NATO is clearly open to including them, and now those countries are much more interested in joining NATO. So I do expect that will happen.
It's hard to phrase it, but I think that the main point is if we are in a situation similar to the early phases of the Second World War, in the sense of the Western powers, the international society, being complacent, using an appeasement strategy with Putin. And he asked, should we expect that the history repeats itself, or should we expect a different result this time?
Mm-hmm. There's a saying that history sometimes repeats itself, but it does not rhyme. So we have seen these piecemeal aggression that I described, Syria, Georgia, Ukraine in 2014. But Russia is a much smaller part of the world economy and the world military than Germany was. And Putin's military has been revealed to be much weaker than many of us thought. And this is against Ukraine, which has fought very bravely, and it's used some NATO weapons, but it does not have NATO's Air Force or the United States Navy. You may have seen just in the last day, Russia lost, even to the Ukrainians, its biggest ship in the Baltic Fleet. So I think Russia is very much overextended in Ukraine, and it could cause damage to NATO, but it doesn't have any prospect to take over NATO countries. I do worry about some scenarios of possible escalation. The most likely would be Russia might attack weapons shipments right close to the borders of NATO. And the Ukrainians have already done some small attacks on Russian territory. They could do bigger ones. And unintended escalations happen in war from missiles that go off course. But I think so far, NATO and the United States have got the balance right. We've been giving the very effective weapons that the Ukrainians can use right now without extra training. The Ukrainians have asked for more advanced aircraft, but I don't think they can actually use them very quickly. Even if you've flown several fighter aircraft, that doesn't mean you can quickly learn to fly another one. And you need to do maintenance, you need to do spare parts. So operationally, I think the best thing is for us to give more air defense missiles to Ukraine, and we're moving to do that. But the United States has ruled out a no-fly zone, and they have not been pushing to send more fighter aircraft. And I think Zelensky knows we're not going to send aircraft, but he keeps asking for them, so we feel guilty and give him more of the other things. And I'm okay with that. I'm happy he's doing that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's more like, es más un comentario, así es que lo voy a leer en inglés, porque está escrito en inglés. Dice, lost in translation for my last question. Dostoevsky said, Russian people grows under the lash, and liberty is for a few. Anyway, what OTAN really is, what NATO really is, do you defend it?
Yeah, so sometimes people make these arguments that certain cultures can't grow to democracy. China likes to criticize democracy as disorganized, not economically efficient. But we have a very successful Chinese democracy in Taiwan. In my view, Putin was not as much threatened by NATO as he was threatened by a democratic Ukraine. It would show that, democracy could be possible in Belarus and in Russia also. And so there are many similarities between Ukrainian and Russian culture, and their peoples share families and they often visit each other. But you notice there's a direct contradiction in Putin's propaganda. He says the Ukrainians and Russians are one people and we're all Slavic peoples. And then he says the Ukrainians are Nazis and we have to kill all of them. So one of the reasons Putin is losing the information war is because he does not have a good story to tell. And so his narrative is really a very desperate one. So when I see people like Navalny risking jail and ordinary Russians risking jail, that tells me people are willing to work for democracy in Russia. And it's not going to happen soon. The oligarchs and the Siloviki are still in power very much. But we also know that generally when countries get wealthier and more educated, they move more towards democracy. And it has not happened in China, as many of us hoped and expected, but I still think in the long run, it may well happen there too. It's hard to have a growing economy with high technology if you have to completely censor the internet. So Russia could grow as long as it could sell oil, but it's not created a diversified economy. And China's economic growth has slowed down now that they're not just learning from what everybody else is doing, but trying to push to the next level of technology. So I remain hopeful that in the long run, we will see more movement towards democracy. It's certainly far from that now, but I still remain hopeful.
Gracias también. Thank you, Andy. Gracias a los entusiastas participantes, a César por su decidida participación y
arriesgada traducción
y por una excelente traducción.
No tanto, no.
And I would like to thank you, Andy, once again for sharing your time with us, for giving us this talk. It's going to be available if you want to download it for your use. It's free. If you want to show it to everybody else, it's also free. And I would like, and I hope that someday in the near future, certainly before China becomes a democracy, we will have you as a visiting professor in our university. It will be a pleasure. And I'm sure that you're going to love Quito. So, muchas gracias, Andy. Thank you very much, Andy. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Les recuerdo que la conferencia estará disponible en el canal de Facebook de la Universidad Andina, del Área de Estudios Sociales y Globales de la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. Estará disponible también en los canales de Facebook del CAEI y, por supuesto, de la Universidad Andina en su totalidad. Andy, I was just saying that, yes, the war in Ukraine is having unexpected impacts on our economy, and that we will have a next talk, a panel, most probably, on those impacts on the Ecuadorian economy. And of course, you will be invited to that talk, and we will find out how to translate it for you. Okay, thank you very much. Gracias a todos. Que tengan un buen fin de semana. Thank you, Andy. Have a nice weekend.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, César.
No, si me permites, Andy, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to translate you today. Y muchas gracias a todos y mil disculpas por los errores que por supuesto cometí durante la traducción. Espero que no hayan sido muy significativos ni gigantes. Gracias a todos. Thank you, Andy, and nice meeting you.
Buenas noches. Bye, bye.